the impact of the pandemic on student learning and how schools are helping students get back on track. I will have an opening statement followed by Senator Cassidy, and then we will introduce our witnesses. After the witnesses give their testimony, senators will each have 5 minutes for a round of questions. One of our witnesses is joining us by video, and I want to thank our committee staff for making that possible. And while we are unable to have the hearing fully open to the public or media for in-person attendance, live video is available on our committee website at help.senate.gov, and the live stream will include closed captioning. If you're in need of other accommodations, please reach out to the committee or the Office of Congressional Accessibility Services. When COVID-19 upended daily life, the disruption for schools and families and our students was especially severe. I mean, seriously, put yourself in the shoes of any kid from Washington State to Louisiana. These kids lost valuable time in the classroom with their friends and teachers. They had to confide in a counselor or teacher over Zoom or a phone, and after-school activities like sports or band got cut totally short. And some kids, as we know, face the earth-shattering loss of a loved one. I hope we can all agree we need to do everything we can to bring stability to our kids' lives, which means keeping our community safe and preparing better for the fall so our kids can learn safely and grow. Now, I've been talking to parents and educators and students back in Washington State about what they're going through. And every single conversation drives home how critical it is that we provide the support kids need to recover from the many ways this pandemic affected them. And I think it's important to recognize how this pandemic has really made things harder for a lot of kids, particularly students of color and students from families with low incomes who often lack access to resources. These students have faced decades of inequitable resources at the schools they attend, undermining these schools' ability to hire experienced teachers and provide advanced coursework options for their students. Kids living in rural communities have struggled, and I believe very strongly that children in the rural Yakima Valley deserve the exact same opportunities as kids in Seattle. I also want to note today is the anniversary of the landmark Olmstead decision, which affirmed people with disabilities have the right to an integrated life in their communities, at home, at work, and at school. We have to keep working to make the promises of Olmstead a reality for everyone, and to me that means considering and meeting the needs of students with disabilities in our policy making. Now, while we are still learning the full extent of how COVID has impacted our kids' learning, we know enough to know this needs to be a top priority for all of us. Data shows that kids are months or even years behind where they would be in a typical year, and a deepening educational divide between majority white schools and majority black schools, between wealthier school districts and higher poverty districts. The results of this year's statewide exams made abundantly clear what other data is showing as well. Our students across every demographic have been affected by this pandemic, and we need to do everything we can to help these students recover. This is something that I have been focused on since the earliest days of this crisis. It's why I was glad we were able to work across the aisle at the start of this pandemic to make sure our early bipartisan relief packages got schools the resources they needed to help keep students connected during remote learning and reopen for in-person learning as soon as public health officials deemed it safe. Given the scope of this crisis, I also fought hard to invest $122 billion for schools in the American Rescue Plan, which Democrats passed, by the way, without a single Republican vote, because recovering from this pandemic and ensuring kids get the resources they need won't just take days. It is going to take months and years. And we cannot shortchange our public schools, our parents, or our kids. That funding we passed, both in our bipartisan work and through the Democrats' American Rescue Plan, has been critical for getting us to where we are today, to getting the vast majority of schools safely back open for in-person learning, to getting schools additional tests and masks and better ventilation, to supporting mental health and counseling services for our students, to providing students with summer learning, tutoring, and other opportunities to address the impacts of this pandemic. And that last part is critical. I worked with members on this committee to ensure that the American Rescue Plan included specific resources to address learning loss. because it was so clear to me from talking with just about any parent or teacher from Washington State that getting our kids' learning back on track was not going to be like flipping on a switch. These are resources that were badly needed and are being put to good use in all kinds of ways, like school districts providing additional tutoring and addressing the social and emotional needs of students. But let's be clear, our work is far from over. What happens next in this pandemic is not a given, especially amid the threat of a fall surge and new variants. We have fought to protect the hard-fought progress we've made, including keeping schools safely open for in-person learning, and that means passing additional COVID funding so our communities and schools can prepare now to keep students and families safe from whatever this pandemic throws at us next. These are resources we desperately need. So I encourage my colleagues to work with us to make sure schools safely stay open for in-person learning this fall. We need to work together to give our communities more than just empty words. We need to get this COVID funding done immediately because our schools and our communities cannot afford to wait until there is a new variant or a new surge. Schools and educators need action from Congress now and support and expertise from the administration so they can plan ahead for the fall to keep our students safely in the classroom because our kids cannot afford to deal with another major setback in their schooling. Especially after the hardships of the past few years, the learning loss that has set so many students months and years behind through no fault of their own, the trauma and mental health challenges our kids are facing, the burnout that's causing so many educators to think about leaving a field they love, and the stress on parents' shoulders as they try to get their kids the support they need. Democrats are working to deliver real solutions for students, schools, parents, and educators on these issues. So I want parents to know this. I'm in your corner, fighting for you and your kids. I got my start in politics as a parent advocate. I organized moms and dads across my state to save a preschool program. I served on my local school board. I know how valuable it is to have parents involved, and I want to make sure every child in this country can get an excellent public education that prepares them to succeed in life, and every parent can have their voice heard and be involved in their kids' school. Our schools are better off that way. That's why I fought to pass the American Rescue Plan to deliver the resources our students, educators, and public schools need. And let's be clear, these resources are helping schools in every single state because kids in every state have been affected by this pandemic. That's why I'm focused on working to support families and lower costs and deliver good-paying jobs. We are focused on the economy and tackling inflation so parents actually have the time to ask their kids about school or to help with their homework and to stay involved. And I'm glad we're working in a bipartisan way to make progress on so many challenges families are facing right now. Earlier this month, we passed bipartisan legislation on this committee to lower drug prices, address the formula shortage, and strengthen families' emergency and retirement savings. And we are in the process right now of passing meaningful bipartisan steps to save lives and keep kids and families safe from gun violence. I want to thank Senator Murphy, who's here today in particular, for his hard work and leadership on this. Now, this package is, of course, not everything I believe we need to do to end gun violence, not by a mile. But the most extreme option on the table is doing nothing at all. This package will close the boyfriend loophole at the federal level, an important step we can take to protect people, especially women, from abusive partners, and its investments in access to mental health will help stem the mental health crisis our country is experiencing. But let me be clear, we have to treat America's gun violence crisis as a gun problem, not a mental health problem. We need, I believe, universal background checks, a ban on assault weapons, and more investment in community violence intervention programs. With that in mind, I'm continuing to work with Senator Burr to negotiate a bipartisan mental health package as well as to address the stress, depression, anxiety, suicide, and so many other mental health challenges this pandemic has made so much worse. And there is more we need to do and so many other challenges that our families and students are facing. But today I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses about how we can tackle one of the biggest, the learning loss caused by this pandemic. And with that, I will turn it over to Senator Cassidy for his opening remarks.
Good morning, and thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for scheduling this meeting. And we're here to talk about our students and the enormous, unprecedented learning loss crisis, which is a direct result of school closures. And I feel as if I have a kind of personal connection with this. My wife is the chair of a board for a public charter school addressing the needs of those with dyslexia. At the outset of the pandemic, she sent them all home with computers in which they could monitor what they were doing online, and if they didn't have internet at home, a Wi-Fi device by which they could monitor. But they had the school had the ability to check on which kids were using which programs. And they found that those children who were at the highest academic risk, the children from the lowest socioeconomic background, never opened their computer. Makes sense. Mom may have been at work, single family, without supervision, and the child was not able to go online. So this idea that we were going to make things up by doing things remotely turned out to be totally, tragically false. I thank my witnesses for coming to talk about this issue. Keeping schools closed flew in the face of logic, reasoning, science. I say that as a doctor, and evidence. And now children are facing the consequences of bad decisions made by adults, with enormous consequences, knowing that now it may take years to overcome the downwardly adjusted trajectory for some of the students further left behind. Now, by the way, money is not the issue. $190 billion has gone through the door to support K through 12 education, but only 23% has been drawn down. So that's troublesome. And even with the massive influx of cash, we still witnessed widespread school closures months into the pandemic, even after medical professionals said it was safe to go back. Also, despite a federal vaccination distribution plan that prioritized teachers and other school employees. But even as more teachers became vaccinated, the goalpost for reopening schools was constantly moved back. Just this year in January in Chicago, teachers' unions shut down schools for a week for refusing to return to in-person learning. And while the adults bickered, the students fell further behind. They struggled emotionally and mentally, which also affected their grades. And while the evidence was clear that it was, in fact, safe to return to the classroom, teachers' unions forced shutdowns to continue, and in many cases, this was enabled by politicians. We know that it was safe to reopen because others in the United States did reopen, and it was indeed safe. Child care facilities and private schools were able to safely remain open even during the height of the pandemic, when the interest of the student was truly put first, rather than the interest of a union or a politician to pander to the union. A way to reopen was found, and the students got the education and support they needed. As a result of remote learning and shuttered schools, we find ourselves in this current predicament. Scholarly research proves just how detrimental virtual schooling was for students. Keeping schools closed was detrimental for all, but especially for students from a disadvantaged background. While students in high-income schools who had access to resources fell behind academically during remote instruction, their peers at lower-income schools struggled even more. English learners, minority students, students with disabilities, and, at least in the experience of the school my wife is involved with, dyslexic students face the brunt of this. Now, we already have problems with achievement gaps. Imagine a kindergarten student who has dyslexia and has yet to be diagnosed or given specific instructions during this time. The student would surely fall further behind, and the damage done could last for years. The student would have trouble learning to read, which would then make it harder for the student to read to learn in the future. Now these achievement gaps have been exacerbated to an even greater degree. Remote instruction has forced students and parents and families into a crisis which we know could have been avoided. One study out of Sweden, where most primary schools remained open during the duration of the pandemic, showed no general learning loss accrued. Now, I want to make it clear that Sweden's decision was not at the expense of teachers and students' health. Severe cases of COVID-19 in students was very low, despite the decision to keep schools open. GAO, the Government Accounting Office, a nonpartisan entity, found that 85% of teachers reported that any form of live instruction, whether fully or partially in person, was beneficial to their students. Equally as telling, GAO found that 61% of all U.S. teachers had more students experiencing emotional distress than normal during the pandemic, and that's just for the students who remain enrolled. Remote instruction also has led to decreased enrollment across the nation. For instance, most remote districts have lost 8.1% of their kindergarten students. I'll also note that private, parochial, and charter schools were, if allowed, much more likely to remain open, and indeed their attendance increased, giving parents the power to choose the school that is best for their child was powerfully good for the child. There's a long road ahead. Keeping schools closed has led us directly to this crisis. On top of the learning loss amassed, students have struggled and are struggling with emotional health. It is clear that the decisions made by adults have inflicted tragedy upon an entire cohort of students. Current students will feel the effects and consequences potentially years down the line if we do not work together to turn the tide now. For each year students are behind academically, learning loss compounds and the issue bleeds into subsequent years, with the next year being worse than the last. We owe students more. They deserve better from the adults who made decisions daily about their lives and future livelihoods. I thank you again, witnesses, for testifying today. Your insight is valuable as we reflect on what could have been done better and how we move forward to best serve our nation's students and their families and our collective future. I look forward to your testimony and once more thank the chair.
Thank you. We will now introduce today's witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Dan Goldhaber. He's the director of the National Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data in Education Research at the American Institutes for Research. He is also the director for Education Data and Research at the University of Washington. Dr. Goldhaber's work focuses on the policies and practices that impact student learning in K-12 schools, like the many different issues that affect our teachers, including recruiting new teachers to the profession and supporting teachers in the classroom to be as successful as possible, and the connections between students' K-12 experiences and their experiences and success after graduation. Thank you so much for joining us remotely for this hearing, Dr. Goldhaber. Appreciate you doing that, and I'm always happy to have folks from Washington State bring their voices to the nation's capital. So great to have you here today. I will turn it over to Senator Murphy to introduce our next witness.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Looking forward to this hearing and welcome all of our panelists. I'm here to introduce our State Education Commissioner from Connecticut, my friend Charlene Russell Tucker. She took over as our state's Education Commissioner when Miguel Cardona was selected by President Biden to serve as our Education Secretary, and I will tell you that part of the reason that President Biden selected Secretary Cardona is because Connecticut was able to open our schools faster than many other states, and we did it in a safe way that put our kids in a position to avoid unnecessary learning loss. And during that period of time, it was Commissioner Russell Tucker, then Deputy Commissioner, who was Secretary Cardona's right hand in making sure that we got our kids and our teachers back in the classroom as fast as possible. She has worked in education policy her entire career. She has had a specialty in child nutrition. She was president of the Connecticut Academy for Nutrition and Dietetics for a period of time. And I will just add that she is someone who understands the needs of the whole child, how a children's nutrition, how a children's social emotional growth is so key to success in school. And when this committee and you, Madam Chair, led the effort to make sure that our rescue plan included funds for summer programming and summer learning, it was Commissioner Russell Tucker who led Connecticut's sort of model-setting effort to get those funds out the door and give access to thousands of low-income kids to summer programming, summer camps, and summer learning. That Connecticut program, I think, has become, as I said, a model many other states are following. So I'm grateful for her leadership and to hear from her today. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Our next witness is Kurt Russell. He is a high school history teacher at Oberlin High School in Ohio. He's advisor for his school's student-led Black Student Union and a head coach for the school's varsity basketball team. He is a 25-year veteran of the classroom and the 2022 National Teacher of the Year. Congratulations on that honor, Mr. Russell. I'm really glad you could join us today to provide a teacher's perspective on the challenges our kids are facing right now. And thank you as well for all you do for your students and for sharing your time and expertise with us today. Our final witness is Erin Wall. Ms. Wall is a mother from Cary, North Carolina, with 3 young children. Now, no two families have faced the same challenges during this pandemic, but it's pretty clear to me that every family is struggling and that we need to make sure we are listening to parents and making sure they have a seat at the table when it comes to figuring out how we can support their kids. So, Ms. Wall, I'm really glad you could join us today to share your family's experience. We look forward to hearing from you as well. With that, we will begin the testimony. Dr. Goldhaber, we will begin with you.
Thank you. Chair Murray and Senator Cassidy, members of the committee, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. As Senator Murray mentioned, my name is Dan Goldhaber, and I direct research centers at the American Institutes for Research and the University of Washington. But just to be clear, the opinions that I'm going to offer here today are not necessarily reflective of either organization. The views I'll express, however, are informed by work I've been doing over the past year with colleagues in a consortium of school districts. This work is designed to better understand the pandemic's impacts on student learning and the efficacy of school district recovery efforts. And some of what I'm going to talk about was actually very well said in the introductory remarks. But let me just say 2 things. First, COVID had a devastating impact on student learning. It's really hard to overstate the magnitude of what we and other researchers have documented. Our analysis of millions of student test scores from last fall found that students were on average about 3 months behind what they would have been expected to achieve in math and about 2 months behind in reading. I don't know if these numbers sound big or small, but based on the connection between tests and future earnings, we estimate that this could result in upwards of $2 trillion in lost future earnings if students don't recover. Historically disadvantaged students are considerably further behind, so the pandemic exacerbated existing lines of inequity in student outcomes. But second, while COVID was on average quite bad, it clearly did not have the same impact everywhere. I'm sure this comes as no surprise. In fact, it's clear from the introductory remarks that it comes as no surprise, but remote learning was generally very bad for student achievement. So places that were remote longer tended to be further behind. For instance, high poverty schools that stayed largely remote in the school year 2021 were behind expectations by about 5.5 months in math versus 2 months for those that were in person for most of 2021. Math achievement was generally worse than reading achievement, but there are some districts that we're working with where we see that reading losses were actually larger than math losses. And so I think the message here is that districts need to carefully assess the status of their students and not assume that the national trends are necessarily reflective of local student needs. In the districts that we're working with, we're seeing lots of smart academic recovery investments, high dosage tutoring, various ways of extending learning time, etc. We don't yet know the efficacy of these investments. That's part of the work that we're doing. But I want to offer 5 things that I think we should be doing to help ensure academic recovery. 1, and honestly, this seems a little silly to say, but we need to make sure to keep schools open. While schools were almost all in person this past school year, some school systems were periodically closed due to a combination of COVID outbreaks and tight labor market. I think to help prevent this, there's 2 things that can be done. 1, states need to streamline the bureaucracy associated with getting and keeping a substitute teaching credential to make sure that there are enough substitutes. And 2, I would urge districts to have plans to reallocate staff so that not all schools close in a district when there are labor shortages. I also think it's important for districts to protect the schools that are educating the most vulnerable students. 2, I think it's important to make sure that district responses to the COVID pandemic add up and that we monitor progress over time. Research can help here by providing estimates of the effects of various interventions like tutoring and summer school. But states or the federal government could take this to the next level with a COVID academic recovery calculator that basically puts together the estimated effects of interventions with the number of students that are receiving them and shows the degree to which this all adds up to changes in student learning at the district level. I would encourage the federal government to require districts to not just submit their ESSER plans, but also make clear that the anticipated effects of their interventions add up to plausible recovery, and to report out at the end of each year whether students are in fact on a trajectory towards full academic recovery. 3, districts are spending a good deal of their ESSER funds on teachers and other personnel, and that makes sense. But I'm worried that some of the across-the-board raises or generic retention incentives that we see are solutions to staffing challenges that are kind of a mile wide and just an inch deep, and are thus not sending really strong signals to the teacher labor market about where there's acute need. So I'd urge districts to tailor financial incentives to schools and subjects that are especially hard to staff. 4, I think we need to improve remote learning. And it was bad for my kids too, so I get it firsthand. But it's easy to dismiss remote learning as a failed experiment that we ought to abandon. But we need to help find ways for kids that are out for sickness in the future, and more generally, to allow instruction for kids that are maybe out because of snow days, and to reach kids with specialized subjects, even in cases where there are only a few kids in a particular district who might be ready or want to take those subjects. So I sort of see digital instruction as part of our future. I also think that the skill set that's necessary for digital instruction is likely to be different than the skill set for teaching in person, so that it's important that we have some innovation about how we prepare, train, and support teachers for this kind of digital instruction. Lastly, I think that we need a sense of urgency. And I frankly fear that a sense of urgency has not fully permeated throughout schools and communities. I urge leaders to make it clear that academic recovery from the pandemic will, in some places, be a long-run project, and that we describe to the community more generally in language that they get the situation. So, for instance, describe learning in weeks or months of learning rather than in standard deviation or scale scores. Clear communication is important because we shouldn't view pandemic recovery as being solely taking place in the schoolhouse. Parents need to know what's at stake for their kids, so they know what to do. They know to do their part in the home, including in some cases getting kids off to summer school. And more broadly, having a clear sense of the stakes involved is important because some of the interventions that school systems may need, like extending the school year, tend to be not so popular. Knowing the urgency of the situation would provide tools to stakeholders to advocate for sometimes politically challenging interventions. Thank you. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Commissioner Russell Tucker.
Good morning, Chair Murray, Ranking Member Burr, and members of the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. My name is Charlene Russell Tucker, and I'm the Commissioner of Education for the state of Connecticut. I am honored and excited to testify before you today and to represent our state's response to the impacts of COVID-19 on student learning and the supports and promising practices underway to maintain a forward momentum. You have my full testimony that highlights initiatives we've introduced for learning acceleration and enrichment, attendance and engagement, evaluating the investments of our COVID dollars, supporting educators, strengthening student voice via Voice for Change, engaging families and communities, and supporting the social, emotional, and mental health needs of students and school staff. I would like to underscore, however, that the single most important construct in place in Connecticut on which we have done and built everything since March 2020 is our best-in-class collaboration, working together, listening to each other in search of common ground for the sake of our children. To illustrate that point, I will highlight initiatives that served us well and provides a vision for improvement that may also be exemplars to others. The Connecticut State Department of Education fortified its relationship with our sister state agencies, particularly the Connecticut State Department of Public Health, at the onset of COVID-19. The Education and Public Health departments worked jointly in distributing timely and consistent communication in response to the pandemic's impact on schools. Beginning in August 2020, I launched with DPH Health and Safety Tuesdays, which are weekly calls that provided opportunities for health and education stakeholders and policymakers to share COVID-19 updates and guidance, to triage questions and concerns and answer live questions. We have had 75 sessions since 2020 through the end of this school year. With over 1,100 registrants, this became the reliable and credible space for maintaining safe school environments. We had districts that aligned their local COVID team meetings with our Tuesday sessions. Questions encompassed the mundane to the complex, such as the number of days of quarantine for close contacts, specific practices to meet the needs of special education students, medically fragile students requiring medication administration and asthma treatments during the school day, requirements for isolation rooms, upkeep on mechanical ventilation systems, and more. Both our agencies learned each week what was needed via policy or guidance to navigate the pandemic and how to assist in keeping our schools safely open. The next illustration specifically addresses learning recovery. We convened the Accelerate CT Task Force to develop a statewide education recovery framework and programming. Additionally, with a focus on populations disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, the department and Governor Lamont designated more than $16 million in our ESSER relief funds to provide comprehensive supports for students with disabilities whose services were interrupted during the pandemic. The final illustration is about engaging families. Family-school connections, one of the department's investment priorities for our ESSER fund, has been especially critical during the pandemic. When families expressed concern about the return to school in August 2020 and 21, we held virtual house calls for parents and caregivers in partnerships with the Connecticut Children's Medical Center and the Connecticut chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Through providing real-time or after-the-fact translations of up to 5 languages, we ensured thousands of families were able to engage with these professionals regarding the safe return to school each fall. What you have heard and will see in my detailed written testimony is this intentionality in working collaboratively towards multifaceted solutions for effective learning recovery and education acceleration. Together, we all must use this moment to think holistically about the continuum of supports necessary for our children to thrive. I will end my testimony there, and I'm happy to take any questions that members of the committee may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Russell.
Chair Murray, Ranking Member Burr, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on such an important topic today. My name is Kurt Russell. I have been a high school history teacher at Oberlin High School in Oberlin, Ohio for 25 years, and proud to represent teachers nationwide as the 2022 National Teacher of the Year. Allow me to invite you into room 200, where I have taught my entire career. A place filled with joy and excitement, a safe place for all children, a place of creativity and learning. Room 200 is home. It's a place I enjoy spending time with students, a place where I feel energized, a place of belonging. Sadly, room 200 has changed. During virtual learning, the room that was bustling with student voices and energy suddenly became silent and dull. The sound of discussions about major events in history, like the role of Margaret Thatcher during the Falkland Wars, was suppressed with hesitance and apathy. The intentionality of reading and analyzing primary texts to better understand the time period was replaced with summaries. Due to the lack of resources and stable internet connections, students became frustrated, and many of my students checked out, ultimately resulting in academic loss. Students who were once able to orally defend and debate the most sacred historical documents with evidence and supporting details are now using emotions and feelings as answers. Along with this, emotionally, students were not well. Online learning caused many of my students to experience social anxiety and even a fear of returning to school. As Oberlin returned to a hybrid model in spring of 2021, over 2/3 of students remained home. This further caused an academic gap for students who remain virtual and for those with learning disabilities. As students suffered during online learning, teachers were also affected. The toll of more responsibilities with stagnant pay has, for some, become unattractive and unbearable. Teachers are leaving the profession at an alarming rate, causing school districts to scramble to find replacements. The disregard of teacher voices and expertise when dealing with educational policies is appalling. It is unfair to blame teachers for the current educational crisis. In order to solve this generational teacher shortage problem, teachers must feel valued and important. Teachers must receive pay comparable to other professions. There must be a concentrated effort to recruit a more diverse teaching pool that better reflects the student population. Thanks to ESSER funding, Oberlin City Schools are able to address some clear problems facing our students and teachers. We hire literacy and math coaches to work with our struggling students, along with providing tools to equip teachers in better instructional pedagogy. Money was also used to provide a summer enrichment program to focus on the continuation of summer learning, while providing recreational activities that support the social and emotional growth of our students. Furthermore, Oberlin City Schools hire a social worker to deal with student and faculty trauma. It is the first time my school has had a social worker in my 25-year career. This is my fear. Despite the unprecedented federal investments that have shown a positive impact on student growth, what happens when the money is no longer there? Many schools will be forced to let go of quality teachers, end summer enrichment programs, and stop new mental health supports. Sustaining ESSER funds is vital in ensuring a successful recovery for our students and teachers. Thank you for inviting me today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Wall.
Good morning. My name is Erin Wall, and I'm from Cary, North Carolina. Chairwoman Murray, Ranking Member Burr, and members of the Senate Help Committee, thank you for having me today and for convening a hearing on such an important topic. I have 3 young children, ages 10, 7, and 5. My oldest son, Carter, has a learning disability which causes significant developmental delays. At the age of 4, Carter entered the Wake County public school system through North Carolina Child Find. Since that time, he has received services including physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, and special education services. I'll never forget that Friday in March 2020 when school as we knew it came to a screeching halt and teachers, students, and parents were thrust into the unknown world of virtual learning. From that point until the start of the following school year, Carter did not receive any of his required services. The following school year, Wake County schools were virtual, which included special education services. One of Carter's biggest challenges in school is his focus, therefore someone had to be physically present and engaged with him during his virtual learning. Considering we had a front row seat, we saw the struggles teachers and students had in trying to adapt. We observed that teachers were spending most of their time trying to focus the students and engage them in their lessons. Students were often distracted and unable to navigate the technical aspects of being online at such a young age. A virtual platform is a huge transition, and for this community of children, change is very hard. The therapies that Carter receives require a hands-on approach. These are interactions that often use personal touch and demonstration to achieve success in reaching his goals. Another important part of Carter's IEP is to build upon and improve his social skills. This requires the teacher to encourage and help Carter navigate these social interactions, which simply cannot be done in a virtual environment. At the same time, we also had to consider the educational needs of our youngest boys. Our middle child was a rising kindergartner, and we enrolled him in a private school which provided in-person instruction. Our youngest son also attended an in-person preschool program the same year. It became clear to us that we could not rely on the public school system to provide in-person instruction, so we had to take matters into our own hands. We hired a tutor to work with Carter daily. In order for Carter to meet his specific educational goals, we had to choose in-person instruction with a tutor over virtual learning. Because of Carter's learning loss experienced over this time frame, we were forced to continue his tutoring on a weekly basis to help bridge the gap. Fortunately, we are blessed to have the resources for this outside service. However, most parents in this situation do not. Up to this point, Carter has always experienced some delays. However, that gap has grown even wider because of the length of the pandemic and continued disruptions to his learning. Just this year, our son's school has experienced the loss of several dedicated educators. For example, Carter's speech-language pathologist left the school at the beginning of December, and that position was never filled, and the vacancy remained until the end of the school year. Carter went 7 months without speech services. On multiple occasions, I was reassured that they were working diligently to fill the position and that Carter was owed compensatory services. However, not only was the position not filled, he did not receive any compensatory services during those 7 months. I also want to focus on the important role of special education teachers and what they face to care for children both educationally and mentally. Special education teachers in the state of North Carolina provide direct instruction and case management that includes paperwork, reports, and meetings. There simply isn't enough time in a school day for all the roles that special educator teachers are asked to perform. Because of all the responsibilities that special education teachers are required, they have very little time to work with the children, which is their passion. Now is the time for teachers, students, parents, and all stakeholders to come together to work on solutions and improvements. Everyone needs to take a step back and really look at our children. A lot of them are not okay. I was recently told by one of Carter's therapists that even if we think a child seems okay, most of them are not. She spends most of her sessions allowing kids to talk and to be heard. We need to slow down, teach the basics, stop, look, and smile at the kids and give them what they have been missing for 2 years. So many children entered school this past year nervous, behind, and unsure. They need to be cared for. School systems need to work closer with teachers and parents to problem solve and develop feasible and meaningful solutions. As parents, we need more support from the school to help our children at home. In brainstorming what might be beneficial, parents need to be in collaboration with teachers to develop strategies to extend their learning at home. In closing, the fallout from the pandemic resulted in setbacks for our children academically, socially, and emotionally. There isn't a quick fix, but I certainly hope that we can come together to create some solutions to help us move forward. Students, teachers, and parents are crying for help. Our boys would not be where they are today if it weren't for the village of teachers and therapists that have supported and loved them along the way. We must take steps to provide support for students, teachers, and parents for the sake of everyone's future. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much to all of our witnesses today. We really appreciate your being here and your testimony. We will now begin a round of 5-minute questions of our witnesses. I ask my colleagues to please keep track of your clock and stay within the 5 minutes. My first question is for Mr. Russell. And first of all, Mr. Russell, congratulations on being selected 2022 Teacher of the Year, and thank you for all the work you do educating our kids. The past few school years have been incredibly challenging for educators, and I know the tragedies in Uvalde and elsewhere only add to that strain, as educators have to help students navigate the heartbreak that comes with these far too frequent school shootings as well. And amid all this, our educators like yourself continue to work hard to get our students back on track. So, Mr. Russell, I wanted to ask you today, what can districts and states and the federal government do to better help our educators, including by addressing burnout and supporting their mental health challenges that they face today so that you are able to focus on what you are expert in, which is teaching our students?
Thank you so much, Chair, for that question. There's several levels to that, to my answer. I think number one is the responsibility that teachers have now is demanding. And there has to be a way in which we could elevate teachers by compensation is one, in regards to making sure that the level of compensation is equal to the responsibility that they have. I think number two is for teachers to have a voice, to teachers to sit down at the table with legislation and create policies. Teachers are the experts. Teachers are the ones that are on the grind every day in the classroom. And I believe that teachers must have the respect to be able to sit down and make policy changes along with legislation.
Thank you. My next question is for Commissioner Russell Tucker and Dr. Goldhaber. The last few years have been incredibly tough on our students, on our families, and our educators. And given this pandemic's impact on learning, we need to do everything we can to help our students get back up to speed and successful, which I think is why it was so important the American Rescue Plan provided schools with the resources they need to stay open and to address students' learning loss, with a particular focus on addressing the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on students of color, students with disabilities, students from families with low income, and so on. Commissioner, let me start with you. Congress required states to address learning loss with the American Rescue Plan funding. How is Connecticut using this funding to help our schools and districts, students address learning loss and address their academic, social, and emotional needs?
Thank you, Chair, for that question as well. So critically important. I'm really pleased to say that we were very intentional in Connecticut to make sure that we had investment priorities. And to your point, the learning, recovery, and acceleration was a big part of that. Our districts are actually investing over $700 million across all the districts in that particular domain. They're looking at smaller class sizes, bringing in tutors in that particular space. But you're also so clear, it's so clear that we have to address fundamentally their social, emotional, and mental health well-being of not only our students, but for our staff. And so that was another funding priority that Connecticut put in place, not just for our district, but also for ourselves with our state set-aside funding. And in that particular priority area, over $183 million have been invested in that space. It's hiring additional support staff, social workers and counselors to be in that space. In some cases, it's working with partner organizations that are providers of services that can also support them in that category as well. So those are the kinds of things that we're working on. In Connecticut, I talk about my big audacious goal, which is to make sure that every school building has that level of behavioral health supports in it to make sure that children can thrive. And the teachers can also be supported.
Thank you. And Dr. Goldhaber, what strategies are you seeing work best to help boost students' learning?
Well, I want to be clear that we don't have evidence yet about what is actually working based on the current investments, but there's lots of evidence from pre-pandemic investments about what works. And there's some of the strategies that I outlined earlier that seem to have quite large effects on student achievement. So, high dosage tutoring, which is, small group tutoring, at least 3-4 times a week throughout the school year, that has been shown to have quite large impacts on student achievement. Double dosing of academic subjects, so where where students may get extra subjects in math or reading. That has large impacts. And then various ways of extending the amount of learning time that students get. So extended school days, Saturday school, intersession, extended school year, and summer school. All of those are strategies that make good sense. But again, as I mentioned before, are a little bit politically contentious.
Thank you. And finally, Ms. Wall, these have been pretty difficult years, and I think parents are concerned about their students' learning is at the highest level since the start of the pandemic. As a parent of 3 children, looking forward, how would you like to see schools and districts use these funds from the American Rescue Plan and better communicate with families?
Thank you for the question, Chairwoman. As everyone has kind of mentioned, I think it's important for the teachers and parents, in the schools to come together to try to help address these needs with the children. Coming, out of these past 2 years, children are faced with a lot of deficits in their learning, and I think that those need to be identified by the teachers, and then the teachers they need training and resources to help those children. I feel like children have been promoted to, the next grade level, and those teachers are required to teach at that grade level. However, those children are behind in math and in reading. For instance, our son, Carter, he's still learning how to read, and he's going to be going into the 4th grade next year. And so a 4th grade teacher doesn't have the training and the resources to teach a child phonics and how to continue their reading skills. And so I feel like they're not able to fully help him. So I feel like, giving teachers the training and the resources they need so that they can then identify those learning gaps with children, and then working with parents too. So parents can then help their children at home and work outside of the school setting to try to help them move forward.
Thank you very much. Senator Cassidy.
Thank you. Mr. Russell, once more, man, how impressive is that? I feel like you're the LeBron James of secondary and primary school teaching, so just hats off to you. That said, Dr. Goldhammer, okay, you say that 5 months is the average for children with dyslexia versus an average of 2 months for all students. What if you just compare students who are lower socioeconomic class versus higher socioeconomic class? What is the difference in math progression in that spread, if you will?
Well, actually, the comparison was not for students with dyslexia.
No, I'm sorry. I should have meant lower socioeconomic class. Lower socioeconomic versus higher socioeconomic. If you just compare those two without the overall average, what is the difference?
Oh, the difference is, and these are roundabout, but roughly, 5.5 months behind for students in high poverty schools versus, more like 1.5 to 2 months for students that are in low poverty schools.
But but in a low poverty school, that is a mix of students. That is those children who are both from poorer families as well as those who are richer. It's just that the average is that the students are richer. Were you able to differentiate again between students who come from a census tract of high poverty versus a census tract of low poverty?
In our study, we couldn't differentiate at the individual school level based on poverty.
Okay, let me stop you there because I have limited time. Ms. Wall creates a very compelling case that children with learning disability or disability in general are particularly vulnerable. Did any of your research look at the impact upon children with, now I will go to dyslexia, but just pick learning disability in general versus those who did not have a learning disability?
Again, I don't want to rely on our research, but I've read a lot of research by other researchers, and the answer is that more vulnerable students were clearly made worse off by the pandemic. It's not clear that that's solely about what was going on in the schools. As I think you mentioned in your opening remarks, some of this may be about what was happening in the homes from folks from different backgrounds too.
Did you track in your, we've talked about the 8.1% of children leaving public schools, but we've seen an uptick of about 240,000 of children going into charter schools. And anecdotally, there's been increased enrollment in private and parochial schools. Did your data track the migration of such students?
No, that was not the focus of our work.
And Ms. Tucker, did in your experience in Connecticut, have you tracked? I don't know of the fall in enrollment in public schools in Connecticut, but assuming that there was some decrease in enrollment, did you track what percent of those students who are no longer in public school are either in a charter, a private, or a parochial school?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. We have a really robust data system that allows us to do data tracking of our students. Specifically, we've looked to see when we did an assessment in the previous year, basically how students did based on their learning models. We've looked, our enrollments are down. And also now coming back up, and we're able to disaggregate. I don't have those specific numbers for you, but we're able to disaggregate our data, and we're able to tell how all those student groups are performing. And to the point that was made earlier, certainly they were all impacted, or students with disabilities, and I know it's a concern of yours, were disproportionately impacted, why it's an area and a student group that we're working very hard to address those needs.
But specifically, were you able to track whether or not the children who disenrolled from a public school subsequently enrolled in a charter? I don't know if you have charters, assuming that you do, a charter, a private, or a religious school?
I don't have that level of data. I did.
Okay, let me stop you there.
Yep.
I happen to know that the people who literally wrote the book on dyslexia, Dr. and Dr. Shaywitz, are in Yale. And 1 in 5 children are affected by dyslexia. So I don't know if you screen, first, the first part of the question is if you screen for dyslexia. And secondly, do you have specific data as regards how those children did during the kind of remote learning period, subsequent to the remote learning period? Did they fall further behind than their peers independently of their income level of the family?
So we've looked at the student with disabilities. We can disaggregate. I don't have the information specifically for students identified with dyslexia, but those or students with disabilities in general certainly were disproportionately impacted.
And does Connecticut screen and then subsequently test to confirm if somebody is dyslexic? Do you screen children for dyslexia?
That is occurring. It is an area of concern for us this past session. An Office of Dyslexia and Reading Disabilities was placed by our legislature in our office to really get closer to those issues, to work with also higher education, make sure that our teachers.
Okay, I'm sorry. She's about to rein me in.
Okay.
Can you tell me what % of your students have been identified as dyslexic?
I don't have that specific number for you, but we'll get that to you.
I suspect there'll be a second round, so I yield.
Thank you. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Chair Murray, and thank you to all the witnesses. I'm going to ask a question about teacher recruitment, teacher retention, and I want to hear from all of you. Before I do, Chair Murray, I just wanted to recount something that I heard not long ago, and it's been a tough challenge for parents and teachers and school board members. I've had some school boards in Virginia, and almost all of our school board members are parents of kids in the system or grandparents, maybe former teachers. They're deeply connected to education issues. Many of them have kids in the system right now, and they're very poorly paid. And I had a school board member at one of my jurisdictions where there has been really volatile public meetings choose not to run again. And I asked her why, and her answer stopped me absolutely dead in my tracks. She said, my salary would not pay for a funeral. She and her children have received death threats over decisions that they've been grappling with, the school board members, and it's been a tough time, and people are stressed. I get that. But I worry about people choosing other lines of work because of a perception that, wow, this is a job that's always been tough, and now I got to grapple with physical security issues, whether it's a shooter in a classroom or somebody who's putting death threats on my email because of a decision that the school board might make. Here's the question I wanted to ask. Ms. Wall talked about in her school, the school that her oldest son is connected with, a speech therapist leaving mid-year and then wasn't replaced till the end of the year. And as I talk to superintendents, they really sing the blues to me about teacher shortages and teacher retention, and particularly about any teacher in the special ed space. So could each of the four of you, from kind of the research standpoint, a state system, a local high school, and parent, just share with the committee what are things we ought to be thinking about in terms of attracting and retaining teachers?
I'm happy to quickly weigh in, and thank you for the question, Senator Kane. I think that we do need to be concerned generally with the desirability of the teaching profession, given everything that's going on in schools. But I also think that it's very important not to talk about teachers generically. because what we know about the teacher labor market is that the degree of staffing challenge varies a great deal based on geography. It varies a great deal based on teacher specialization. So you mentioned special education teachers, and that is an area where I think that it is much more challenging to staff classrooms than it is to staff, for instance, elementary education classrooms. And it is tougher to staff classrooms in schools that are serving disproportionately disadvantaged or historically marginalized students. So my view, and this is perhaps not surprising as I'm a labor economist, is that we ought to be focusing resources in the areas where there's more acute need. And so that would be, again, the places where staffing challenges are more extreme. And I do think that additional pay and retention incentives do make a difference in terms of the likelihood that we're going to attract people into the profession.
Excellent. Could I ask Commissioner Russell Tucker? I would love to hear from everybody before my time expires. Commissioner Russell Tucker.
Thank you, Senator. And certainly it was an area of extreme focus for us, as you can well imagine, with schools open, trying to address the staffing needs, helping our districts address the staffing needs. Some of the things we've done with our state board, that we've looked at flexibilities around certifications, and I think those are things we need to continue to look at. And long term, so there's a short term, but long term, how do we continue to encourage folks to come into the profession, which is so important? And that's work that we have to continue to do together, and not without hearing from the teachers themselves. What is those things that make the environment much more attractive to come into, starting with students as well?
Mr. Russell, what are those things that make the environment more attractive? So you're well positioned to answer that question.
Yes, thank you so much. Number one, the value placed upon teachers have been lost, that respect. Once upon a time, teachers used to be the pillar of a community. Now that's no longer there. The respect of teachers in regards to their expertise is taken for granted. So therefore, there's many things that we can do in order to increase. Number one, as I mentioned in my testimony earlier, is pay. We have to be compensated. It's not an attractive profession because of that. And I think number two, as I said earlier, that teachers must be a voice in regards to policies and legislation.
Chair Murray, could I ask if Ms. Wall could respond briefly? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Senator. I spoke to a lot of Carter's special education teachers leading up to today. Sadly, 2 of them are leaving Carter's school, and I think it's because, as Mr. Russell touched on, pay is obviously a huge concern of theirs, and also they're just stretched too thin. I mean, special education teachers have to educate the children, but yet they also have to handle the case management, which is a lot of paperwork and meetings, and that eats up a lot of their time, and they're not able to work with the children, which is their passion, and that should be the number one thing that they're working on, is the children and their education, and there's just not enough time for them to be able to do that.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Chair Murray.
Thank you. Senator Tuberville.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here today. That was excellent questioning there for Senator Kane. I've spent 40 years teaching and coaching, and you hit it right on the head. Respect, environment, and pay. Mostly women are our teachers, higher percentage of them. And I think all 3 of those should be accountable if we're going to get our education back to where it should be. So thank you all for being here today. Mr. Russell, as you know, Congress appropriated 3 waves of federal K-12 pandemic relief funding. In the 3rd wave of funding that came with the passage of the American Rescue Plan in March 2021, Congress required school districts to set aside 20% of the funds to address student learning loss through evidence-based interventions. What evidence-based interventions would you prioritize, if you were running your school district? What would you do with that 20%?
Thank you so much, Senator. Thank you so much, Senator, for that question. There's a couple things I would do. I think, number one, I would have a more robust inclusion program with our students, making sure that all of our students are able to be included within the curriculum. And what I mean by that is making sure that teachers are equipped to teach all of our students, making sure that students receive that quality of education that they deserve. And I think number two, as we have done at Oberlin High School, is that we hire specialists. We hire instructional coaches to really focus on students who are struggling, and also to really focus on teacher instructional pedagogy. So those are the two things I will really focus on.
Anybody else got anything they want to add to that?
Just a point on that, not all our schools were resourced similarly. And so within our districts, we have districts that received $40,000 and districts that received $200 million. What you can do between there is really very different. So allowing districts to assess their need and determine what needs to occur for them locally, I think is really important.
Thank you. Anybody else? All right, Ms. Wall, extensive research has shown that students achieve more in school when their parents are involved in their education. I think we'll all agree with that. And as a former educator and coach, I couldn't agree more. I've seen it firsthand. Children are empowered to reach new heights when their parents or guardians are engaged. In your testimony, you highlighted that as the parent of a child with a learning disability, you supplemented your son's virtual learning with a tutor who provided in-person instruction. While not every parent is fortunate enough to do that, your decisive action ensured your son would not fall further behind the classroom, which I've seen that time and time again. In your opinion, what are the primary barriers to parent involvement in school programs? What do you think keeps parents out of involvement now?
Thank you, Senator, for your question. I think, one of the struggles with the virtual learning was just, the time of day. I mean, it took place in the middle of the school day. Parents were at work, and they weren't able to sit there with their children at home and be a part of their school day. So I think that's the biggest issue, and I think that's why it's important for teachers to work with the parents to help identify what those learning gaps may be, so then the parents can be more involved with their children, whether that's, at the end of the school day, helping them with their homework or, providing tutoring services, whatever that may be, but just, finding the right time so that parents can be involved in that educational process with their kids.
Thank you. Ms. Russell Tucker, recent data indicates that charter schools experienced undeniable success despite COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, nearly every state saw charter school enrollment increase in 2019-20 school year to 2021. In Alabama, there was a 65% increase in charter school enrollment and a 1.4 decrease in public school enrollment. In your state of Connecticut, charter schools saw a 1.2% increase in enrollment and a nearly 3% decrease in district public school enrollment. Without charter schools, overall public school enrollment declines might have been far worse, leading to further learning losses. Why do you think charter schools experienced record growth during the pandemic?
In some cases, Senator, I believe families were looking for smaller learning environments, and so that was something that they might have gravitated to. And I know in Connecticut, we've worked across the board for families to be able to have the ability to make decisions around what they needed to do for learning, but also critically important that our schools are all sharing specific information with families so they can make decisions, to the point sometimes of having families walk through a building to have a sense of health and safety that's in that building. And so it really was important to make sure that all our families were able to make those decisions based on the school types that they were a part of.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Smith?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member. And thanks, welcome to our panelists. I really appreciate this discussion today. I want to focus in on mental health and the importance, the value of providing good mental health services in schools. This is something that I've heard consistently from parents and students and also educators in Minnesota, even before the pandemic. But of course, the pandemic really exacerbated that challenge. In Minnesota, I'm sure like a lot of districts, we really struggle with finding resources in order to provide this. Minnesota actually has one of the worst school counselor to student ratios in the country. The recommended ratio is 1 to 250 students. In Minnesota, it is 1 for every 654 students. And it's even worse for social workers and mental health providers, psychologists, and so forth. So one of the things that's happened in Minnesota is that ARP funding has been deployed to address this challenge. In Albert Lee, Minnesota, they're hiring counselors and a social worker. In Dover, Iota, they're bringing in outside mental health professionals to try to fill this gap. So, Mr. Russell, and then I'm going to turn to you, Ms. Russell-Tucker. As an educator, could you talk to us about the value, what you see around having mental health professionals in schools to be able to provide fill that need for students, and what difference it makes in the work that you're doing?
Thank you so much, Senator, for that question. There's a great need for that. In my testimony, I mentioned for the first time in my 25 years of teaching, we had a social worker. And what I noticed is the emotional and mental growth of our students were substantial. Our social worker brought in new ways of trying to encourage our students. Our social worker was able to really tap into not only student trauma, but also faculty trauma as well. And from there, it seems as though there's a healing process that is taking place. And so therefore, it's a great need. Even in my teaching, in my classroom, what I noticed as students are more emotional well because of the social worker that we brought in, and students are more able to really focus on the lesson at the moment. So
that allows the sort of the link. Of course, it's just one student. It's not like, oh, here's my emotional wellness self and here's my academic wellness self. It's one person. Everything that I've read has talked about the sort of how there is also a delay social emotional development growth, just as there's been academic, delay in academic growth because of the pandemic. And it sounds like that's what you're seeing as well.
Yes, I am.
Yeah. And Ms. Russell, would you like to comment on this from your perspective, what you are seeing as far as the importance of addressing mental health care needs for students in their learning environment?
So thank you, Senator, and that's a passion of mine. Even before the pandemic, we recognized that students had to have their social emotional well-being addressed because that's foundational to learning. And so we made that an investment priority with the ESSER funds that came in, not for just ourselves. And we also realized in Connecticut, so all our districts, as I said, have invested over $183 million across the state. We're also doing it from our state reserve as well. But our legislature just passed landmark legislation on mental health that is also providing additional resources for schools to be able to hire mental health staff and others that they need, assess what they need at the local level. It is critical for students to learn. And it's also critical for staff when we talk about the environment that they're working in, that their needs are also met. But if their needs are met, then they can also focus on teaching and learning.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. I think this is an area of very important focus for us. And I want to just note that not only has this committee just is in the midst of doing really important work, marking up and working on a mental health, broader-based mental health legislation, but in the package that we just voted on for last night, we're also looking, as we look at gun safety issues, also looking at mental health issues and what we can do to support that. I think that that's a very important priority. Maybe just quickly, Mr. Russell, before I run out of time here, I also believe that strong after-school programs are incredibly valuable to help to support students and kids. We are seeing how rescue plan dollars were used to extend after-school programs. My colleague on this committee, Senator Murphy, has worked a lot on this, and I've been glad to partner with him. Could you just have a minute to talk a little bit about how those after-school programs also can be helpful to advancing kids' social, emotional, and academic growth?
Thank you so much again, Senator, for that question. Yes, it has been a great, great benefit to our school district. Because of the ESSER fund, we was able to create and to enhance our after-school enrichment program. Our program goes from after school to around 6 p.m., maybe 3 hours a day. What we bring in are tutors, but at the same time, we bring in recreational activities, just in order for our kids to be kids. And what I noticed is that after-school program has really benefited our school. As I said earlier, in regards to bringing the social worker, the after-school program has been a direct link into our emotional well-being of our students as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Casey.
Chair Murray, thanks very much, and thanks for having this hearing, both thank you and the ranking member. I wanted to start with an issue which I don't think anyone here or anyone listening would contest, and that's that the pandemic has had a devastating impact on students across the board. There's just no way to calculate that or adequately describe it. That devastating impact on children in our schools is often worse if that child has a disability. And obviously all of you are critically concerned about these issues that relate to children in our schools generally, but in particular with regard to the terrible impact of the pandemic. I wanted to start with Commissioner Russell Tucker to ask you about that focus on children with disabilities, and in particular, children with disabilities in our schools who may not have had access, I should say, to all of their individual education plan services. We know the American Rescue Plan provided dollars to support reopening schools and about $130 billion, as I recall, and dollars to address the academic challenges students face. It also included additional funding to support students through the IDEA, through those grants. What do you think we need to do, Commissioner, to support the academic renewal of students with disabilities to ensure that they can achieve their academic potential?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. And, as I laid out in the testimony, in addition to the IDEA funds and the additional resources which we're grateful for, that we also tapped into the state's reserve funds to even add to that, because this is so critically important for us to do. We need to listen and hear from families what they're experiencing so we can provide specific supports. We need to hear directly from our school districts about what their challenges are as well, so we can be, again, supporting them in all their needs. Connecticut has 80,000 or so of our students who are students with disabilities, and back to a previous question, about 11,000 of them with dyslexia. So it's really important for us to lean in on our families and hear directly from families what their experiences are and how to support the children. And also from our children, their voices matter as well as we're doing this work.
Could you also expand on the question of how states are using those rescue plan dollars to support students with disabilities, either through the lens of the state of Connecticut or more broadly?
So thank you again. We see in Connecticut that districts are using it for supplementary tutoring and reading instruction. We've also provided individualized in-home supports by organizations that are able to do that, certainly doing more special education evaluations and ensuring that IEPs are indeed implemented, as we know that there were disruptions to that. So working very closely with our districts, those are the things that are emerging, and we're looking to also share those as best practices across the system as well.
Commissioner, thank you. And another question for you as well. I don't think anyone would contest as well that the pandemic was the ultimate emergency on so many fronts and so many facets of our lives, and in particular for schools and for students and for educators. I have a piece of legislation called Prep for All Students Act, which would make sure that the voices of students and families, students with disabilities and their families, are included in school emergency planning. You've engaged in extensive efforts to get that kind of stakeholder feedback, including parents and students, on how to prioritize the use of elementary and secondary schools' emergency relief funds. How would including the voice of students with disabilities and their families help to improve both the quality of emergency or preparedness planning, as well as the effectiveness of that planning?
Senator, I always say it cannot be about them without them. And so it's so critically important that they're at the table. And this is what we've championed in our state, hearing from our families of students with disabilities, engaging, frankly, even with their attorneys that are supporting families, so we know exactly what the issues are. So their voice is critically important. It's not an afterthought. It must be a part of the dialogue and conversation. We've got to hear that perspective so that we can craft policies that are not in search of a solution or in search of a problem, but actually addressing a problem that does exist, and it is a real solution with intended results.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thanks, Chair Murray.
Senator Rosen.
Oh, excuse me. Thanks. It's on. Thank you, Chair Murray, and thank you, Ranking Member Cassidy. And I really want to thank the witnesses here today for your thoughtfulness and your caring on behalf of the children, the families, everybody who works in the school and the community. Really appreciate that. I want to build a little bit on what Senator Smith was talking about in student mental health, because we are in the midst of a youth mental health crisis. It's only been made worse by the pandemic. We know how hard distance learning was for everyone, particularly difficult for students with mental health challenges. They lost access to their friends, to their teachers, and to, if they were available, any in-school mental health resources they may have previously relied on for support. Tragically, in Nevada's Clark County School District, the number of students who died by suicide in 2020 more than doubled from the year before. Tragically. And so we have to do more to help. So along with Senator Cassidy, we are working on bipartisan legislation that would reauthorize and enhance a federal program to train teachers, school staff, and other personnel to better recognize the symptoms of youth mental illness or mental health issues before they escalate, referring students and their family members to appropriate community-based mental health services. And I've also introduced bipartisan legislation with Senator Murkowski to expand SAMHSA grants for comprehensive student mental health promotion and suicide prevention to K-12 school districts. This money is currently only available to colleges and universities. So I just wanted to build on that. You answered my questions already. So the next thing I want to move to is the learning loss. We had a lot of learning loss. It highlighted our educational inequities, face our students in low-income rural communities. As Senator Casey mentions, our students with disabilities. And so we have to focus on eliminating that educational deficit as quickly as possible. I know in Nevada, across the country, educators are working to move forward and overcome many of those setbacks. So, Dr. Goldhaber, as we prepare for the next school year this fall, how do we bridge the gap for those students who face the most inequities and challenges, particularly our low-income minority, our rural students, and as Senator Casey highlighted, you have responded to our disability community?
Well, I think that one of the things that's really important is that we do a good job of figuring out which students really need which kinds of help and tailoring the interventions to really target those students and target the kinds of help that they need. And I think that the school systems, at least that we're working with, we're seeing that kind of targeting and a lot of the kinds of investments that one would expect and hope for. Again, tutoring programs, extra support in core academic subjects and summer school. But I guess I want to take this moment to just sort of emphasize something that was said earlier, which is that systems received very different amounts of money, and there are some estimates out there about whether it is going to be enough. And my take is that it's going to be enough. The ESSER funds are going to be sufficient to help students in lots of school systems, but not all school systems. So I think that we need to look at this as not a short run, we're going to get over the hump in a year, but in some cases a longer term endeavor, and make sure that we're keeping our eye on the ball of student achievement when hopefully the pandemic has faded in the rearview mirror, but that it may not have fully faded in terms of learning loss for some students, so that in the out years we're continuing to provide support for those students that really need it.
Well, thank you. I want to build on that in the short time we have left, because we can't do all of this without addressing the teacher shortage, especially in specialized subject areas such as career and technical education. In Nevada, we're hearing that we have about 1,500 CTE educator positions currently unfilled due to insufficient resources. So again, Dr. Goldhaber, what does the initial data tell us regarding which subjects are most at risk in terms of teacher recruitment and retention? And we can build up mental health services and other wraparound services, but we need educators in the classroom. So what do you think we need to do to help there?
I think that just very quickly, there are four areas. So you mentioned CTE, special education, STEM areas, and ELL are all areas where the staffing challenge seems much more acute relative to teachers at the elementary education level. And what's important is that it is acute for different reasons. So in the case of special education, there's higher than average attrition of special education teachers. But for instance, in the case of STEM teachers, it looks like there's an issue with the number of people who are being trained and entering the workforce. So I guess I would just sort of push us toward tailored solutions that really get at the nature of the problem. And ultimately, I think that we need to have school systems send stronger signals to the teacher labor market and prospective teachers about the areas where there are real shortages and challenges in getting classroom staffed.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Cassidy.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. You know, in my opening remarks, I mentioned how unions and politicians enabling the unions have really done a disservice to our students. I mention that because as a physician, I know that brain development intertwines, or if you will, interacts with the instruction a child receives. So if a child misses out a year of education when her brain is at that critical point of development, it may not be recoverable. That's what we have to acknowledge. And at the outset, in the chair's testimony, she had mentioned some differences between the two parties. I'll mention those as well. In these packages that we passed to give financial aids to school, it was a battle for Republicans to get resources for parochial and private schools. And once we allocated it, some Democratic governors refused to give it. It was incredibly frustrating. But that probably points to a difference in perspective. From the Republican standpoint, we take it from the perspective of the student and her or his family, not from the teachers, or not from the school itself. And that is distinctly a different perspective. Because Ms. Wall, you spoke about taking your children into the private setting. And you implied, you were very delicate, that they cost you a fair amount of money, but your family could afford. There are a lot of families out there who cannot afford. Any comment on that, Mrs. Wall?
Thank you, Senator. We had every intention to send all three of our children to public school. I went to public school. My husband went to public school. However, when it was clear that public school was not going to provide in-person instruction for our children, we chose to send our middle son to private school. Now, had they had in-person instruction, he would have been at public school. So we made that decision for him because we knew it was best for him. And he had more or less a normal year. And we were grateful that. But as you mentioned, most families...
Stop for a second. He had essentially a normal year.
Yes.
And you're about to say most families could not afford such an arrangement.
Correct.
And I suspect if you had to send all three, it would have been difficult for your family.
Yes.
So, Mr. Goldhaber, Dr. Goldhaber, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. I guess I just wanted to strike a little bit of an optimistic note because I actually think that recovery is possible.
Can I stop you on that because I need to develop another point? In your data, did you differentiate between students who attended a public school and students who attended an alternative setting?
No, these were all students that were in public schools.
And what about those who are in charter versus those who are in traditional public?
We did not separately analyze. We were looking at data from test scores administered by NWEA, and we didn't separately look at students that were in charter schools.
Sounds good. Or I understand that. Let me put it that way. Then let me make the point that I do know that there were religious schools and private schools and charter schools that made the decision to remain open and or to open earlier and or to put in these enriched possibilities, but not, public schools were closed. Now, what we've heard today, we don't need Dr. Goldhaber to have analyzed that because what we've heard today is that the determinant variable in how students did was whether or not the school was open from the point of view of the teacher and from the point of view of statistical analysis. So really, our focus should be, how do we give the parent the right to choose the school where her child can get the best instruction for that child, no matter the moment? If one school is shut down, then another school would be open, and the parent should have that choice. We've also heard that there can be financial barriers in order to achieve that option. I've introduced legislation that would encourage the ability for a family of limited means to still be able to attend the school that is best for their child, because another school might be closed or for other reasons. So I hope that in the future, both parties, it can be bipartisan, that we take the perspective of the student and her family as opposed to the school itself, agnostic as the school, so that the child will actually have the greatest opportunity for herself or himself. I thank you all for being here. I yield.
Thank you. Commissioner Russell Tucker, I wanted to ask you, given the very real threat of the fall surge and emergence of new variants, we need to be supporting our schools right now as they prepare for back to school in a few short months. And more disruption for students and families just cannot be an option. So that's really why I am so focused on passing supplemental COVID funding to make sure you have tests, vaccines, treatments, so that schools and districts and parents are prepared for whatever comes next in this pandemic. And I also want to make sure that HHS, the Department of Education, are giving very clear direction to our states and school districts so they are preparing now for fall and winter. And Congress, by the way, also needs to pass an extension of the school meal waiver to help make sure our schools are feeding our kids. But Commissioner Russell Tucker, can you lay out what steps you in Connecticut are taking to make sure schools and school districts are ready for the fall and winter, especially if we face another surge?
Thank you, Senator. And in my testimony, you've heard me talk about our Health and Safety Tuesdays and the collaboration with our communities. The last meeting we had with this team, we asked them. So we asked everyone that was on that call, please tell us what it is that you need for this coming for the fall. We're meeting in a few weeks. We're having our own summit with public health and the Department of Education to start thinking about what are those things that we need for supportive, and with our history, what we've learned in the past to where we need to go. The resources you've talked about, making tests available, all of that was a part of our package that we were using to support and that we're looking forward to. But it really is going to be important for us to think about, if there's a new variant, what do we do to make sure that learning is not as interrupted or disrupted as it was in the past because of what we've learned, and that we're pivoting to based on that. So, and all of the supports from the federal government is certainly important as we go back to our states and continue to think about planning for this upcoming fall based on lessons learned.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our witnesses today. That will end our hearing. I want to thank all of our colleagues. I want to thank Dr. Goldhaber, Commissioner Russell Tucker, Mr. Russell, Ms. Wall, for a really thoughtful conversation about the challenges that our students are facing from this pandemic and what we can do to help them recover and to thrive after such a few very hard years. For any senators who wish to ask additional questions, questions for the record will be due in 10 business days, July 7th at 5 p.m. And with that, the committee stands adjourned.